Hello everyone, and welcome. My name's James Harding. I'm the editor, along with Katie, a co-founder of Tortoise. And there's a particular joy in hosting this ThinkIn. We started this newsroom, this enterprise in journalism, at Fora over in East Castle Street. Actually, we started in Clerkenwell, and then we came to East Castle Street, and now we're here in Berners Street. We've travelled around London with Fora, and it's been home to our newsroom. And a year and a half ago now, David Marks, who I hope many of you will know, who's the co-founder of Brockton Everlast, called us and said, we need to think about London. We really need to think about London. It was a time when 6 months or so, probably even 4 or 5 months or so into the pandemic, it felt as though we didn't know what the future of our city might be. And so together with Brockton Everlast, with Fora and with JLL, we hosted these series of ThinkIns. We never did this. They were all on Zoom. And the attempt was to try and think about the future of London. It felt as though all we wanted to do at that time was get back to its past, to the London that we knew. But the exercise was to think, well, what will we learn from the pandemic? What will change London, and what we hope for it next? And we always promised ourselves that when we came back in person, we'd get together in our newsroom and hold a ThinkIn. And our ThinkIns, if you've not been to one before, are essentially intended to be exactly like an editorial news conference. They're essentially, you come in, everyone's supposed to weigh in with a point of view, and at the end of it, we try and distill what we've heard into a mixture of what we know and what we think. And tonight, what we're really trying to think about is what's changed in London and what needs to change next. And we hope that everyone will, or as many people as possible, will weigh in. Matt and Katie and David and I will try and kind of kick things off, but please don't hold back. Like, don't wait. If you've got something to say and you think it hasn't landed, please say it, spell it out, and we'll make sure that we weave it in, because there's a further iteration to what we've done so far, which is supposed to be a distillation of what we've learned and where we think we go next. 2 things about the process so far, one symbolic and one in your hands. When we started, some really small things mattered a lot. We tried to make sure that we were getting together people who had real power and influence in our city, politicians, policymakers, leaders of some of the biggest banks and businesses. But it was also really important to keep in touch with organizations which were transforming the city and which were really much needed. And if you look on the inside page of the paper, you'll see that we were backed by the Eve Appeal, Place to Be, the 1928 Project, and Trees for Cities. And I wanted you to look at it for 2 reasons. One was, frankly, this was your idea, David. That was a very good one. But I also wanted to remind ourselves how lovely it is all to be holding papers. And the second thing that we've done, or actually, David, you've done, is really mess us up. So the old inky-fingered hacks at Tortoise who came out of newspapers and misprint, and Katie and I have this conversation about every 6 months, are you sure we shouldn't print a newspaper? God, how we love it, how great it is to have a paper. So the paper itself, though, is a distillation of the conversations we had. We held about a dozen ThinkIns. We tried to kind of tackle London thematically. Please do read it. It's, if you like, one very long editorial about the things that we think are needed in London. We really did think about it, and John Hill, who's our genius designer, really put a lot of love into designing it. And if I were to distill what it says, is it basically says 3 things. We have ambition for this city. The ambition for this city is in no way reduced. We have, or at least should be, paranoid about the place of this city in the country and the world, really paranoid, and we love it. We love the city. Ambition, paranoia, and love are, I think, the messages that you'll get from this. And so what we'd love to do is translate those into things that are a little bit more factual and a little bit more tangible, ideas, if you like, that you can drop on your foot. So, David, I'm going to come to you first, if I might. When we did those first ThinkIns, I think the one thing I remember you calling me up and saying, do you think we can have a picture of St. Paul's at the beginning? And the point was that St. Paul's had been built after a pandemic. St. Paul's, for whatever it was, 300 years, was the tallest building in the city.
In London.
In London, yeah. It lasted. There was a reason to be, if you like, a little optimistic on the other side of the pandemic. Kind of, were you right about that? Do you look now, as things emerge, and think, actually, London's trajectory is still quite positive, or do you think it's going to look like there was a fundamental check on the growth of the city and the life of the city as a result of the last couple of years?
I think that, people's decisions, that they're the most important decisions they make in their life, who they live with, who they have families with, where they live, where they work, etc., were completely called into question. It was like a giant pause where people decided, what was really important to them, and they got off the hamster wheel. And for that, I think there were a lot of positives. I can't remember the name of the guy who was the chief economist at UBS, who was one of the speakers in the early sessions we had, said for the first time in history, living in London is now no longer an economic decision. It's a lifestyle decision, in the sense that, the technology worked, Zoom, Teams, whatever worked. You were not penalised for obviously working from home during the pandemic, and I would say you're partially penalised for working from home now, because you miss out on a lot of things now that we've kind of whipped COVID, if you like. But living in London is no longer an economic decision. You don't have to live in London. So London has to work a lot harder to attract people back, in the same way, on a micro level, that the workplace and Fora and Berners Street has to work a lot harder to also attract people back.
I just want to pick up on that. I mean, this is probably a slightly self-selecting group, but how many people here, just as a show of hands, think that even post-pandemic, you're likely to be penalised in your career by working from home? This is very close to my "is Boris Johnson a liar?" response. Who thinks you won't be penalised? Those people are at home.
There's 10,000 people on Zoom going like this.
Oh yeah, actually, let's see. Is there a show of hands? Will anyone who thinks that they won't be penalised, who's working from home, put their digital hands up, and we'll send around a care package. That's interesting. And how many people here, can we just do just a rough thing? I'm interested to know, how many people here think, though, the optimum number of days working in an office has fundamentally shifted from 5 to 3 to 4? Who thinks that it should still be 5?
Can I just say?
Yes.
Before the pandemic.
So, will you just say your name?
Mark Slim,
Yeah. So, Mark, hang on one second. Hold on. Could you get a mic? Thanks so much, Joe. Yeah.
Sorry. There were loads of people working from home before the pandemic. This had already started. It's not a new thing. We had complete freedom in our business to work from home every day of the week if we wanted to. Now we don't. Things have changed. And there are quite a lot of businesses...
So Mark, what happens at CBRE now? There's a designated day for working from home.
You should get permission from your line manager for work from home, and he will tell you what day of the week it will be, because we're trying to stop people doing it on Friday and Monday so they can have a 4-day weekend. It's as simple as that. And we want life in the office 5 days a week, not 3.
So weirdly, you think it's sort of a little bit more repressive and controlled now than it was?
Our office on Friday afternoons before the pandemic was a wasteland. There was no one there. Now there are people there. And I think that is repeated across many corporates. I think this is a complete myth that this started because of the pandemic. It was well on its way to happening before the pandemic.
I'm going to come back. Does anyone else have thoughts on that? Because we do. Actually, David, we were just talking beforehand. Yes. You seem like a nice man.
Enrico Sana. co-founder of Fora.
Yeah.
So we actually have some data on this, just to back the previous point. And we will look at the buildings where we were tracking attendance pre-pandemic and post-pandemic. Actually, on a Friday, we now have more people than we used to have pre-pandemic.
Really?
So, so I agree that the trend of working from somewhere else, people think about working from home, but it's actually working in a third space, which could be, you could be on the road, you could be in a cafe, was already there. And people were at least users, residents of flexible workspaces that perhaps are slightly more progressive, were already adopting a much more flexible work life. So I agree with your
But sorry, Enrico, are you saying that you at Fora might be seeing numbers because people are working from a flexible working space on a Friday, or you're actually seeing even amongst all of the companies that work here or in the Foras that they've got higher attendance on a Friday than they used to have?
We have more attendance now from all the companies on a Friday than we used to do before. But if you look at utilization, let's talk about utilization, which is on average how many people you have in a building versus how many people could be in the building. The utilization is very much back to what it used to be. But I think the point I'm making is, therefore, the trend was already there. It's probably now more widespread because users of flexible workspaces perhaps are slightly more open-minded about how their employees engage in the work lifestyle, in the work-life balance. So, but I think what we're seeing today is not COVID. It's just what's happening.
It's a change. Katie.
Have you noticed on our Friday 5:30 call who's in the office? It's all of the younger tortoises who are using it as a social opportunity. They drink all the beer that we've left downstairs from the week. You hadn't noticed this. And then they go out because they're making the most of London in that sense that, they're enjoying being back together. But there's definitely, it'd be interesting to look at the data to see if there's a demographic around the kind of utilisation piece, because sort of a Friday sort of for working parents actually is quite a nice one to work from home because it enables you to be at home on a Friday. But actually if you're pre-kids or post-kids even maybe, then actually it's a social thing. And this chap is nodding away at me when I'm saying that.
So, yeah. Joe, will you just pass to Tess?
Oh, yeah. I was going to pass to you.
What's that? Okay.
Yeah, I would furiously agree with that. I think it's I do agree that there's been a reassessment for everybody as to whether they want to live in London or not. But for working parents, myself, my wife and I, we both work. It's been a complete game changer, and for people in my team, they are able to structure their work around schools in a way that was simply not really possible before the pandemic, and it's sort of because we were all sort of forced into these bubbles, and assumed primary childcare in a way that we hadn't previously. Going back out into the world of work, I think everyone has wanted to recalibrate on that front. But I do think, with reference to your comment about the fact that this is a trend over time, I think that it is a trend that has just been accelerated as great events of this nature do. It has accelerated a process that was already happening by 10, 15 years. I think we may have reached this point anyway, but its characteristics have facilitated themselves in 12 to 24 months when, in fact, I think it probably would have taken 15, 20 years.
Tess, you want to say? And so, sorry, what's your name?
My name's Richard.
I was just going to add, I wonder if also where this trend was emerging pre-pandemic was sort of in perhaps more creative or senior levels within organisations. I wonder if what the pandemic did was make it feasible in situations that nobody ever thought was feasible for. So it's quite interesting to see how much it sort of dropped down into jobs where there wasn't the seniority to set your own hours, where there wasn't the sort of, whether you were on a eat what you kill commissions, do you know what I mean? Where that autonomy and output-based work would allow you to do that. But actually there's now just a broader base of people where there's a proof point that actually very large number of jobs that were previously thought not to be remote feasible as remote jobs actually have proven to be. So it's dropped down sort of the food chain, as it were.
But I just wonder, sorry, sir, do you want to say something? We'll just pass it over 1 sec.
I was only going to say that we're architects, and we found that it was our younger members of staff who were the first back because they had the least attractive housing, and obviously wanted to be. You learn through being with your peers, and the social aspect of work was really important. And so they've in a way they kind of dragged us all back, the older generation, and that's probably a good thing.
Do you, David? Can I just ask you? Sorry, because I interrupted you just as you were getting into the sort of what we're actually seeing in London and we're seeing in terms of usage of space. And I suppose there were kind of two bold forecasts being made when we got started in autumn 2020. One was the office might never be the same again, and central London might never be the same again. Both would get hollowed out. Mm-hmm. What's the truth of that?
I think it's a good thing that the office is not the same again, because Enrico and Katrina, who started Fora with us, their whole premise was offices are terrible. I mean, they're just, they're just so boring and dull, and they need a giant kick up the arse. Mm-hmm. And COVID's given that to the office, to the workplace, I think, in a good way. And I think, there's a tiny but growing percentage of places in London that are commute worthy you want to come back to. And that will continue to grow over the next few years as more next generation buildings get delivered. So the offices were crap and shouldn't be the same again. Central London has got a lot of issues, but I mean, it's buzzing again, it's busy again.
Issues?
Yeah, just the general, Elizabeth Line's helping with transportation, but everything else is still, this is a whole other series of topics, but housing, transport, air quality, inequality.
All covered, I should say, in London's future.
Yeah.
At a news agent near you.
Yeah.
But actually, we're going to come to those things in a moment. One of the central ideas or central questions of the project was, okay, let's get some really smart people together and work out what the plan is for London. Right? And the interesting thing was that the more we talked about it, the less we liked it as an idea. We liked the idea of a centrally planned London, and actually it was more around principles for London, what would enable a kind of innovation and energy and a growth in London. And Robert, I wonder whether I can just put you on the spot, because one of the thoughts that came up that you talked to us about, this is Sir Robert Leckler, who's the professor of immunology, amongst many other things, but also had this idea. Well, you can tell us what the idea is.
Well, thanks a lot. Yeah, so I would say that one of London's ambitions should be to become one of the biomedical capitals of the world. I think it's well poised to do that. So it's a really interesting moment in healthcare, and start looking at me aggressively if I'm going on too long, James. Do feel free. Go for it. So, on the one hand, healthcare systems around the world, and certainly in the UK, are under extraordinary duress. I think you all know that. Exacerbated by the pandemic, but it was true before the pandemic. Demand's going up, aging population, multimorbidity, money's going up, and just doing more of the same is not going to fix it. So, Houston, we have a problem. On the other hand, that's offset by unprecedented opportunity. So, fresh approach to population health. I won't go into what all this means, but fresh approach to population health and health inequality, an opportunity to re-engineer the model of healthcare using technology to make it productive, and thirdly, curative therapies. So at the moment, medicine, as you probably know, cures very little. We help people live with their long-term conditions, but actually we're entering a decade when, with gene editing, manipulating the immune system in cancer and autoimmunity and regenerative medicine, I think we're going to cure some of the really big diseases. So it's a very exciting time, but to realize that opportunity, you need three sectors to come together, and that's healthcare, academia, and life sciences industries. And London is just poised to do that. So we've got some fabulous hospitals, we've got some great universities, we've got the Crick Institute, et cetera, et cetera. So the assets there in healthcare and academia are brilliant. Industry, there are 5,600 life sciences companies in the UK, almost half of those are in London. We've got some of the big guys, GSK, J&J, MSD is just building a discovery institute in King's Cross. we've got the regulators, MHRA's here, NICE is here, et cetera, et cetera. So really, it's an opportunity that we must seize, and I think we are doing. The remarkable thing, I'll just add and finish on this, and something I couldn't have said 10 years ago, there is space to allow this to grow and expand, and that's a remarkable thing to say. So those of you who have been out on the A40, you'll have seen the proliferation of towers in White City. This is a project driven by Imperial. It's fabulous. Most of that's life sciences stuff. In fact, I'm on the board of a company there. In my patch in central southeast London, there's several acres of land opposite St Thomas's called Royal Street, in the hands of Stanhope, the developer. Guy's site, there are 2 plots of land just been put out to tender, 21 bids managed by JLL, 21 bids by developers to develop this as a life sciences park. There's Olympic Park East, there's Whitechapel, the old London Hospital. So it's a really, really fabulous opportunity. And I think the reason it addresses so many of these issues is that it's all about health and wealth. And this will begin to address health inequalities, which are appalling in London, absolutely appalling. I used to give a talk about comparing Hull and Hampshire, 9 years life expectancy difference. North and South Southwark was a 9-year life expectancy difference. So we have to do something different. And I think this life sciences cluster concept that I'm trying to articulate will not only be good for patients and so on, but it'll actually be good for populations because of some economic regeneration, etc. So I'm really excited about that dimension of London's future.
And Robert, will you just, firstly, I just want to make sure I got the notes. Population health, curative therapies, and health inequality.
Re-engineering the healthcare system to make it a productive, sustainable model, because at the moment it isn't fundamentally.
But if you're like me and you sort of go, oh, that's great, and then you're halfway down Berners Street and thinking, well, what do I do? Who's kind of, who am I writing to? Who am I calling saying, okay, this is a good idea? Who's the convening?
Yeah.
Who's the sort of old street?
Again, I think you should be reasonably encouraged as to the way this is working. So actually, it started when a certain Mr. Johnson was the mayor of London. He actually was there for the launch of something called MedCity. So we, recognizing this opportunity and recognizing we were behind the curve at the time compared to Boston, for example, we launched something called MedCity, which is a small agency that is a kind of front door for London for industry partners who wish to come in and navigate their way around this complicated landscape. So MedCity exists. And is doing well. And then there are clusters within MedCity. So we just launched a cluster in central southeast London called SC1, which I'm co-chairing with Lord Kakar, and that's doing all the stuff I'm describing. The same thing's happening in other bits of London. So it's happening. And then within London, there are 3 what are called academic health science centres, 3 big sort of healthcare and academia partnerships, Imperial, UCL and King's. Again, we meet together regularly to plot and plan what steps we can take to ensure that we're making the most of the opportunity. So it's a kind of, it's not actually, it's not an organization as such, but it is being convened by people like-minded people.
Does anyone have views on this? Yes, sir.
Can I just ask, curative therapies, does that include arts and culture as well?
Mm-hmm. So what's your name?
Paul Gray from the National Gallery.
Right.
I'm not sure if I understand your question. Do you mean that arts and culture have a curative effect? Because I absolutely agree with that.
Are they part of the solution? And if they are they part of the solution? And if you believe they are, then surely that's another strength for London.
Oh, absolutely. No, I completely agree with that. So we do a lot of stuff with the South Bank in SC1, the cluster that I'm leading. And we've got a program funded by the Wellcome Trust looking at music and rehabilitation. So yeah, no, I mean, I'm passionate about the arts myself. So I do think it hugely adds. I mean, it's one of the reasons that people come to London, isn't it? I mean, so a lot of this depends on talent and continuing to attract talent despite Brexit and all the sort of other things that we bemoan. But I still think London's a very attractive place. So when the Crick Institute advertised junior faculty positions, they were flooded with hundreds of applications from around the world. And of course, one of the reasons people like London is because of the rich cultural sector as well as the life sciences.
Paul, Robert, thank you. I don't know whether anyone else wants to talk about this particular issue. Sir.
Hi, my name's Aidan from John McCaslin Partners. I get it, and I love the optimism and the reality of the investment and the potentiality of the life sciences. And I also love the narrative about the healthy city. And I was reminded as you were talking about Ruskin's great, the only wealth is health, which is so true. And perhaps absolutely one of the outcomes of the COVID is to make us all realize, hopefully, that, the priority of health and welfare is as important and fundamental to all of our lifestyles. The trouble is, and it's a question I don't know the answer, is that the news, the actual performance of the NHS, the actual care of the institutions of health and welfare, of which we should be so proud, I can't see the connectivity and the virtuous kind of feedback and improvement that comes from this level of investment that's clearly there in the life sciences. And that's the thing I can't quite solve. I've heard the narrative so many times recently, for a couple of years now, about this investment in the life sciences, and it's real. I totally believe it. I know it's real, but I just can't quite see the bridging gap and how actually that investment and all the positives about that and potentiality of that are ultimately going to improve for all of us, for my children and their children, the actual performance of the health system, the welfare system, to actually care for people. That's the bit I can't understand.
Do you want me to respond?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, depressingly true. And so I completely understand what you're saying. My response would be that the second of the opportunities I described is to re-engineer our model of healthcare. I mean, basically, we've had the same model since the NHS was formed in 1948, roughly speaking, and it's very unproductive. And in terms of dividends of the pandemic, I mean, we've discovered that actually online consultation isn't so bad. There's an emergence of AI-assisted diagnosis. There are many bits of technology that I genuinely think can change the model to make it productive and improve outcomes at lower cost. And we have to do that. Otherwise, we're just heading for a car crash. I mean, unless we have a government that's going to hike taxes substantially, it's just unaffordable. So I think it's a sort of burning platform moment, I think. And I mean, this morning I was at a conference for our local integrated care system. That's the new NHS reorganisation for South East London. And everybody was talking about health inequality and what are we going to do to address it. So I've never known a moment when the public conscience about inequality is so acute. And I do think, I mean, I'm not promising it's going to happen, but I do think it can happen, because I think I won't bore you with how, but I think really the system can be re-engineered to be made a lot better.
I just want to do one thing, if I can. Do you want to just jump in? I just want to pick up on the point, if I can, move to this kind of culture point that Paul makes, and I wanted to bring in Matt, and I'd like to sort of ask Katrina and come back to you, Paul, on this. When the Brexit vote happened, one of the things that I remember amazingly Mike Bloomberg saying was, "Oh, London will be fine." And I was like, why? Why is it going to be fine? Because, well, you've got the parks and the theatres and the museums. And given that the Bloomberg terminal doesn't do anything in terms of reporting parks and theatres and museums, it was an amazing comment on what makes a city. And one of the questions, obviously, as kind of the theatres opened and closed and the museums lost tourist revenue and then lost footfall, was, well, is that proposition fundamentally changed? Is culture itself fundamentally changed? I just wanted to, Matt, hear from you what you thought about it. Katrina, ask you.
It's a great question, and I mean the initial answer was thanks to the Cultural Recovery Fund and some very nifty footwork by individuals we know, like Nick Coleridge, Nick Eitner, and a few others, Noel Dozer. And then, to be fair, Oliver Dowden at the time being Culture Secretary, and also, to be fair, Rishi Sunak, who recognised that there was needed a not huge in terms of the overall spend on COVID emergency, but quite substantial. I think it was 2.5 billion in the end, to keep the lights on, and that did work surprisingly well. I mean, combined with furlough and the other bits and pieces, the damage done to the cultural landscape was not anything like as awful as it looked like. But there's a sting in the tail, which is levelling up, which is that the the big houses, the big money makers are all thinking, right, okay, some of this isn't working, Cinderella didn't work, and we may have to make redundancies, but essentially, not quite business as usual, but we're back. And then the announcement is made that levelling up in culture just means that all the money is going to go out of London. So I was talking to the chair of a major London artistic house the other day, who said that if this goes through as Nadine Dorries is planning, and the grant to Arts Council England goes according to the numbers that are projected, that house will have to cut at least 25% of its staff in the next 3 years.
25%.
Yeah. So suddenly you're looking. He said it was like being back in early 2020. When it was actually, can we keep the we don't have the money to keep going indefinitely. Lockdowns are a disaster. Even between lockdowns, people aren't really going. The footfall was much diminished. But we made it through, and now I think that it was not expected in the culture sector in London that levelling up just meant it was a zero-sum game, as it were, that what they were really going to do is take money out of London, public money, and hurl it performatively at the regions. And if that does go ahead, it will be really bad news for the reason, the Mike Bloomberg principle that you enunciated, because there's absolutely no doubt. And everyone, you talk to anyone in the finance sector, why is one of the reasons that graduate trainees and banks and so on always used to put London very high on their list of places they want to do their early tours in, was because it had fantastic culture and spaces, and it still does. But it's not strategically great to do that.
Can I just ask you, and Paul, you might have an answer to this, and Katrina too. I remember Mervyn King, I think, saying that when people write the history of the first half of the 21st century, this first 50 years, Brexit is going to look like a tiny little blip in the economic picture, nothing like 2008, 2009. The real restructuring of the economy was the financial crisis. I'm not sure he'd say that now, but that's what he was saying back after the Brexit vote. Is it the case that if you look at the cultural kind of heat map of the UK, that actually levelling up is going to have a bigger impact, do you think, than the pandemic on London?
I think if you take this is an evasive answer, but I think if you take the three, that certainly levelling up is going to have a role that no one predicted. When it was first introduced as a sort of bromide meaningless phrase, I think everyone just thought it's a bromide meaningless phrase, and it'll be fine. It's just his way of saying we're not going to do anything about inequality. Can I go now?
Yeah.
But what it turned out was that he was going to try and do something about inequality, but by taking money out of the engine of growth of the whole country, which is not a hugely brilliant idea. And so, I actually, oddly enough, in culture, I think Brexit was and is a disaster because it's added so much to the costs of bringing shows here, of getting, the business of, for example, of putting on an exhibition. The business of getting stuff from place A to place B has become unbelievably more complicated.
Katrina, I'll come to you in a second, but is that right, Paul? Are you having that at the National Gallery?
Yes, broadly, but I just wanted to go back to your first question about probably the impact of the pandemic on the cultural sector and maybe its significance in London. Certainly, I think there was a case of London underestimated the value of the cultural sector in terms of attracting people. And certainly when we were the first national organisation to reopen in July 2020, the West End was desperate for that moment in a way that other retail weren't able to fulfil that need. So I think there's been a reawakening of the importance of culture to London in terms of its importance as an attractive destination, both to international and domestic market. I'll come back to domestic in a minute because I think that's one thing we probably got wrong. And in a way, what London has to offer in a way that most major cities don't offer is our free national museums. I mean, it's the most amazing thing. If you go anywhere else in the world, they just don't have that offer. So that's an amazing thing that we should celebrate. I think certainly for major national organisations, certainly us, I think we overplayed our hand with international audiences, and I think we possibly need to refocus on, or certainly re-engage with the domestic market, because I think in a way that's been a mistake for particularly those cultural organisations that charge a fee. And the levelling up piece is interesting, because the only thing I would say about that is I absolutely don't agree that money should be spent outside London at the expense of cultural organisations in London. But I do believe that national organisations that are based in London have a greater role to play outside of London.
Yeah. Well, Katrina, have you got a mic? Rob, thanks.
Thank you. I think for the cultural landscape, London's always been a lifestyle choice. It's never been a monetary choice to move here. And we've always seen musicians, artists, fashion designers moving to the city. And when it comes to London and the cultural landscape, what I'm really concerned about is where we are in 5-10 years. When you look at London, what I loved about the city and why I moved here is we celebrated punk, we had ska, we had white reggae, I can go through the list, down the road on Wardour Street, we had the New Romantics, we brought dance culture, and now it seems to have stopped. And I think a big problem is that a lot to do with Brexit, we're not getting the mix, the cultural mix in. That's what excites people about the city, where you can find an audience and bring new ideas for and new waves and culture start. And now I'm not seeing that across the city. And that's my biggest concern for the future. Where's the fringe going to be?
But Katrina, can I just ask you, has the fringe moved? Is one of the things that's happened in London that while the kind of the economics of London have centralised, the culture of London has become more of that 15-minute village. There are, especially if you go, sorry, forgive me, that direction. If you go east in the city, it's transformed culturally.
But there's no new tribe. I think that's what I'm coming to. There's no new label, I think, that people and new generations are identifying themselves with in the city. So in 5-10 years, I'm worried where the new talent's going to come from.
Huh. Okay, interesting. Okay,
and
Katie.
Also, I don't think it's left London. Like, I've been going out, looking.
What do you mean? It's not moved to the Shires?
I don't think it's in Hastings. I don't think it's in Ramsgate. I've looked. I'm looking, if anybody knows.
So I'm going to come to you one moment. I just want to come to... So Katie, one of the things that's interesting, if you saw the original numbers that came up, was just the colossal dent to the tourist numbers. And the other was, if you read Richard Nodder, he's the kind of prophet of paranoia, if you like. He's the one who says, if you're not anxious enough about London, you're going to see this drift of finance and banks and financial services. If you were trying to market London, if you're like, look at this now, 2020s, what would you do?
I love the way I get that one.
Yeah.
So I actually don't think the problem is with the international market long term. So I do actually think that tourists will come back. I think that that's just slower to come back and the numbers probably haven't caught up. I think that the domestic audience is perhaps the one that I would worry about. So I think about future generations and sort of, how many Dick Whittingtons that are living in Britain. So, I don't know. Maybe I went to the wrong university, but I definitely, as a 20 and 30-something, didn't see London as the place to have the best free sex on the planet, which is a quote in our newspaper. But, and I wouldn't necessarily say that is the strapline for London. That is in there from a professor at UCL, as a matter of fact, but not in life sciences, I hasten to add, in places and city planning. But it's great, isn't it? But that's not why I came to London. I think the idea of ambition, so I love your vision of sort of creating a new ambition for London, but I was amazed when you were talking about London to begin with, and you said the city, and David immediately corrected you and said London.
Yeah.
And there is a branding job around London where I think that, the city means something very specific. It means finance. And, I moved to London. I have actually probably no idea why I moved to London when I moved to London, but I thought it was the only place I could get a job that would take me, which turned out to be the creative industries, which is probably true, the only place that would take me. But I think now I would be talking about future generations, and I think it comes back to this point around the affordability, the accessibility, and what the ambition of the city is. And, you know, for me, marketing London needs to be not just a place to love or a place to learn. It needs to be a place that you can live as well. And I don't actually think London is necessarily a place that I think lots of people want to live. And I think it took me leaving London, i.e. not the pandemic, but actually moving to New York to appreciate London. And when I moved to New York, I suddenly went, oh, London is absolutely amazing. And those people who work at Tortoise know that I bloody love the Queen, but I can now say I bloody love London. And having lived in New York, where the only place you ever see nature or life is when you look up and you look at the sky, or you're lucky enough to live next to the Hudson or next to that pub. It's not really a park, it's just concrete. You come back to London and there are trees everywhere and there is green spaces. So I actually do think the thing for me is about how do you make a city that people want to live in? And that is environmental, green spaces, job opportunities, affordability. And for me, I think it's great that we've got all of these great things, but I still just don't think it's a city that if you're 20 or 30 years of age, that this is the one that's crying out for you to come and live in right now. So I think that's our biggest challenge.
Just a show of hands, who here thinks that quality of life in London has declined over the last decade? Yeah, just a judgment. Who here thinks it's sort of improved? Who here thinks it's much the same? Well, and just, Mark, you can't do that. You think it's improved and it's much the same?
Well, so I lived in Soho.
Oh, I see. You were putting your hand up to speak.
Yeah.
So, okay, sorry, forgive me.
Sorry, I didn't mean to hijack it. But so I grew up in Soho and I lived in Soho until quite recently. And there's a real problem with that particular part of town, and it's replicated in other parts of central London, where it's seen as an attractive area to live. And so wealthier people move in and buy places, rent places. But then they complain, oh, I live in Soho and it's really loud. So they complain to Westminster Council and have the bars shut down. Mm-hmm. So their quality of life has gone up because they now live in a slightly quieter place. But the quality of the area and the qualities for which it's known start to disappear, and everything starts to look a little bit more anodyne and vanilla, and you lose the characteristics that made it attractive in the first place. So it's a difficult question.
Sir.
Yeah, I'm Tim Smither, Knight Frank. Really interesting picking up all your comments about media city culture and change and things like that. I love my city. Been here 50 years, seen it change from the 70s to it gleaming in the city now. But I truly believe that we're about to see the issues of Brexit coming through. You talk about the NHS, 130,000 job vacancies there. There are, you talk about culture. Andrew Marr talks about Britain's soft power, punks, our design, all that. It's amazing. But I just wonder whether, you've mentioned his name twice in this conversation, Boris Johnson, has he damaged London? Because the foreign press look at us like we are just a bunch of idiots at the moment, and it's concerning. Maybe Tony will tell us about the monies that are flowing in and around, but has London been damaged by the Brexit and our current political issues?
So I didn't hear your name, sorry.
Tim.
Tim. I mean, I have to say, I had one really chastening experience 3 weeks ago. We were talking about trying to hire someone. And for the first time in my life, we were in Switzerland, Cape Town, Switzerland, and someone said, would I have to move to London? I was like, hang on, that's the whole perk, So I think there is something there. Can I just make a plea to people? We've got about 10 minutes left. One of the things that we've kept on trying to do in the course of these conversations is point towards things that are practical, that could change London, that what we need next. I'll give you an example, because I keep plugging this. It's going to happen, but it's going to be a long run. I thought one of the things that really shocked me and distressed me about the city that I love was how much unfairness was exposed during the course of the past 2 years, and some of it in obvious ways that was generational, and some of it that was in economic ways, and some of it in housing that people talk about all the time. But to Katie's point about the joy of living in a city where there are trees and there are green spaces, the inequality of access to the green really, really upset me. And I live not too far from the canal that goes right the way through, quite a lot like the Elizabeth line actually, right the way through the city. And if you walk along the canal, you can't help but notice what a colossal waste of space that is. Right? There's about 2 to 3 meters of junk all the way along the canal that, if someone cared enough, could be essentially a citywide park, much like the High Line in New York. And the problem is, it's a little bit of everybody's land. And I remember we talked about this, and we tried to work out how you would do something about it. And administratively, it's a nightmare, because the mayor doesn't own it, and London Transport doesn't own it, and property developers don't. Everyone owns a bit of it. But I would love us to come away from this project, London's Future, and think, well, we had a first stab that thought about some big ideas, and then we came away with some really practical projects where we said, okay, you know what, let's get behind these 3 or 4 things where we've really, you know, like your thing, Robert, where it's actually, okay, we believe in this idea of London as a, you know, centre for biomedicine, and we're going to back it. If anyone's got thoughts about that, sorry, Tess, you've got one, but if anyone's got thoughts about that,
I would just say one thing for me was missing from Robert's ingredients when he was talking about the coming together of academia, the teaching hospitals, government, life science, capital coming in. The thing that's missing for me, and it's a really boring technical point, but it's not high culture, but it's high finance. The capital markets here are structured wrong. You know, Martin Sorrell called the FTSE 100 a Jurassic index, and he's absolutely right. And there was a story in the paper today about ARM, which is one of the most strategically important, you know, semiconductor manufacturers in this country. Will they list in London? Will they list in NASDAQ? Well, even with the crash in the NASDAQ, it's
still going there.
Who knows? I mean, I'd love them to see them here, but the capital markets need to change so that the startups and the biotechs that are here feel not only can they be based in London for all the talent, but they can IPO and pay taxes here and grow here. So that needs to change.
Yes.
Boring point, but it's
important. No, it's important, although I think Rishi Sunak would say, actually, one of the projects that they've tried to build is this London Markets project, isn't it? They are. I mean, I think they see that. Yeah.
Practical solution.
Yeah.
Repurpose office space for the key workers we so desperately need. You know, bring trainee nurses back into the city. The joy of London is Peabody, it's Guinness, it's a cheek by jowl way in which we love. We don't have rich ghettos. We're developing them because, you know, we're crowding people out. So bring back that sort of plural living environment. But we desperately need to create seriously affordable housing for where we're recruiting. So, you know, there used to be nurses accommodation all the way down, you know, next to every hospital. We don't have any of that. Let's bring it back. Let's bring those young people into the city and make it work for them. And, you know, we've got to decide if this is a city for the young, for the old, for the rich, for the poor, but it's got to be for everybody. You've always had that plural. You know, you go to a very expensive house in Pimlico, you're right by Peabody Estate. It's brilliant. It's brilliant. It's the way it should be. It's always what London's been about.
Is there a moment, David, can I just ask you, I'm coming to you in 1 second, Robert. Is there a moment, David, because before we would talk, I was asking you, what do you do if you've got an office block in Swiss Cottage, right? Presumably, if you've got an office block here, you're in Clover. But if you're on the other side of the Circle line, is life getting much more difficult for you as a landlord?
Well, we sort of don't own them in those locations.
No, that's what I'm saying. Not you, but not you, Watson. Yeah, I mean, you, the kind of the landlord world.
Well, they need to be converted to housing. I mean, that's, you know.
And how easy is that?
On the one hand, it's easy because you have PDR, so you have permitted development rights to convert an old clunky office building into apartments. But the hard thing is trying to police the developers to design it in a way that it actually is affordable and design right. It isn't just a sort of cheap knock it out to Malaysian investors who then put it on the buy-to-let market and it's buy-to-leave. And that's, it's not impossible, but that doesn't get done by the mayor and the housing minister and the local authorities.
So, would you say who you are?
I think the one thing that...
So would you say your name?
My name is Lee Polisano.
Okay.
You know, a lot of it for me goes back to, I think all these questions are quite interesting, but a lot of them are a product of policy, right? You know, having been involved with the CRIC and knowing that the mortality rate around there is quite shocking when people know it. I wonder if its presence has improved that mortality rate. I doubt it. I think the issue about working from home as a result of the pandemic isn't really the big question for London. The question for London is the pandemic exposed the weakness in the health system. It exposed the weakness in communities. And all we were left with was a local community to help people because central government failed them. Not just here, but everywhere in the world. And so if you want to make London an attractive place, you start at a grassroots level, at the community level. You know, and you build strong communities. Real estate plays a role. Arts and culture plays a role. Giving people places to do things. That's where the basic principle of making a city livable for people is. It's at the community level. You want to get a park. I mean, if you try and build a park, the response from a local authority is, I need more housing, because I have a policy that promotes housing. Nothing gets built. It's very good to have policies because that reelects you. But if you can't, you know, administer these policies, you can't deliver on the policies, it doesn't matter. You get elected on your policies. You don't get elected on the results of them. So a policy that makes...
So can I just ask you a question? Sorry, we don't know each other, so this is kind of slightly like right to the heart of it. Do you think that autocratic regimes are building better cities than democratic ones?
They will in the next 10 years. They will in the next 10 years. They'll build more environmentally friendly cities. They'll build more environmentally progressive cities. They'll solve the decarbonization problems. They'll do a lot of things because they need to create institutions and things like that. You know, just getting back to the point, no one says, I need a park here more than I need housing. Or I need a community facility here more than I need housing. Or you know, I need something else to balance what urban life is really about. It's, I think, you know, all of this is a failure at the policy level. And that's really the grassroots thing here.
I should just say, it's a pretty extraordinary thing what you just said, though. I mean, I'm sorry just to kind of be caught short. You know, just to think to ourselves, if you think about the world's greatest cities, I wouldn't put a city in an autocratic regime, certainly in the top 5, not in my top 10. That's an amazing thing if that's the case.
They're not at the moment.
No. I'm just saying, I think that's, I mean, just in terms of the spirit of paranoia, that's
You have to also remember that autocratic cities have different conditions. Most of the governments that are autocratic are governments in extreme climates, for example. They're in places where it's difficult to do the kinds of things we're able to do here in London, right? Their access to certain kinds of technology and things is more difficult.
I'm just going to ask Nina, right? Come on, Nina. You come from a beautiful city, Odessa. Tell us whether what you think.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Nina. I'm a journalist of Turtis, recently employed. I'm Ukrainian. And when Katie said, I'm bloody loving New York, I was sitting and thinking, I bloody love Kyiv. I came from Kyiv. I admire Odessa as a person to visit. Like when I visit Odessa, I love it. But my heart belongs to Kyiv. And I want to say that in no one city of the world you would do any good for people if you are building the autocratic regime. Because autocratic regime only cares about itself, doesn't care about people. And if we make an opposition between like having a park and having a healthcare, we make a big mistake, because the medium for life consists of fresh air, green parks, beautiful lakes, clean rivers, and it cannot be gained by autocratic regime. You can look at Moscow, and this would be the best illustration for autocratic regime, because there is no civil society in any autocratic regime. There is no civil society, no civil activists to fight for better place to live. And I miss Kyiv so much, just because, you know, we are not ideal, but they were beautiful places, and I miss that big river, and I miss the green parks, and I miss everything which makes this city so special. And I just want to say that I would never, ever sacrifice any utilities for autocratic regime. Thank you.
Nina, so do you want to make... Yeah. So, hold on, just wait for Mike, sorry.
The New York City that we all love,
yes,
and I grew up in, was built by an autocratic mayor.
The mighty Robert Moses. Yes. Robert Moses is a sort of... But Robert Moses is kind of the perfect study, isn't he, of what it's like to be an 18th century monarch in a modern city. So we're going to...
And Straight Line Crazy is a great play, by the way, if you've seen it on Robert Moses. No, I was just going to reinforce the affordable housing point. I think, you know, if there's one thing we could shift, that would be the one I would focus on, I think, because, again, back to the crick. I mean, young scientists are not paid terribly well, relatively speaking, to city workers, for example. So recruiting people, I mean, most Nobel Prize winners did their Nobel Prize winning work between the age of 35 and 45. So it's when they're young. And so it's the young talent that we have to find a way to get into this city. And unless we do something about housing, we're not going to do it.
By the way, yes, sorry.
I was just going to add to that. I mean, in terms of Liz. In terms of our staff, since the pandemic has happened, it's been all the youngsters starting families moving out of London, and they just cannot afford the housing in this city.
Yeah.
So we need to address that. And I think, you know, generally the audience is all of an age where we've been able to buy houses that were cheaper, and that's just not the reality for the young people of today.
So,
I'm not going to speak on behalf of all young people here, but I think it's also the type of young person now that can afford a house. So I have a friend, and lots of my friends decided to go into banking or to become lawyers. That is just the worst, like my idea of hell. Sorry to everyone here who is a banker or a lawyer. But I'm sure it's not. But it's just not how my brain works, and that's completely fine. And I think that's what's so lovely about London is, and I grew up in Greater London, so I'm very lucky I still live with my parents and I can afford to do that. But you know, I'm looking. I actually had quite a horrible conversation with my dad yesterday about how I probably won't be able to afford to live in London, and if I want to, either I'm going to need serious help from him, or I'm going to have to change job. That's what I'm looking, or marry someone very rich. So, you know, they're not great options for me. But my best mate is about to start at Linklaters, and she's already got a flat, and she's, you know, living in a lovely place by the river, and it's all very nice. And it's that thing of, why can't we all live in London, no matter what you want to do with your career? Because I would argue that, you know, we both work as hard, we both deserve to live in London, and we both love the city. So,
Sophie, I should just say that Torsten Bell, right, who is probably my favourite economist, when he joined us, his point was exactly the same. If anyone is young enough to not be married yet or in a long-term relationship, you need to think really carefully about who you should be married to. If you weren't born with wealth, true. You have to marry into it in modern Britain.
Yeah.
I mean, I know he was being... but he's not. You know.
He's not.
All right, I just want to say, so we've obviously not for the first time run out of time. We mostly got on time when we did these ThinkIns online. We've slipped over a couple of minutes. I said to you at the beginning, this was modelled on an editorial conference, a leader conference. And so I'm going to play the trick on you that was played on me, you know, every day for years at the Times, which was to say, well, that's very good, but Giles, what do we think? And Giles Wattell, who is an editor and partner here at Tortoise, was the chief leader writer of the Times. And Giles, if we did, at the end of this hour, say, OK, well, that's great. What do we think? What would we say?
This isn't going to be elegant. I decided to use highlighters to sort my notes as between opportunities, which I put in, and good things, which I put in green, and challenges, which I put in another colour, which turned out to be blue. Let me be very quick. Stuff that we can be pleased has happened over the past 2 years, 3 years, including COVID, and build on. David pointed out near the top that offices are terrible. They needed a kick in the arse, and COVID has given them that kick in the arse. Robert obviously made the plea for London as a world-class biomedical capital. It's not there yet, but the ingredients are. Paul reminded us to celebrate not just our museums, but the fact that they're free, in contrast to many others. And I guess after what Nina said, we can embrace the fact that we're not yet run by an autocracy, and take advantage of the fact that we're not at war, and build on that. But there's an awful lot of blue in my notes, and people. The general tone has been positive and optimistic. But David started by pointing out that London now, because of the option, which by the way, Sophie, is open to you, of working from home, London now has to work a lot harder to attract people. There seems to be a consensus in the room that more than ever it's a lifestyle rather than a financial choice to be here. David listed housing, transport, and equality and air quality as issues that still need to be fixed here. James was very exercised in particular by unequal access to green spaces, Mark by the vanillarization of Soho, and acutely unequal access to healthcare. Though I should remind everyone in the room that one of the findings of our recent poll was that 70% of a very large sample of 10,000 people, a representative subsample of whom will have been from London, are very satisfied with the services the NHS offers. I was surprised it was that high. Cultural London, emerging from COVID, has a problem with footfall. Paul's other point, which is in blue rather than green, is that he feels that the cultural institutions of this city still have to re-engage or find a strategy to re-engage with the domestic market. And I thought one of the most interesting points was Katrina's about there's no new tribe. That's my quote of the night. And where is the new tribe going to come from? No optimism that it's going to come from within or from Hastings or from Ramsgate. And on the subject of sort of internal migrants to London, Katie's doubtful that there'll be many Dick Whittingtons coming here for free sex. By the way, the free sex conversation was started earlier today, and I just don't know what it means, but and then finally, if it is true, and I defer to the expertise in the room, that the capital markets for which this city is famous are not structured to support startups, then we're in trouble. So I hope they reorganize themselves quickly.
When we started this project, one of the very first thinking we held, we talked about the Elizabeth line and this idea of a kind of new equatorial way of getting across London. And a week or so ago, I had my first kind of zip down the Elizabeth line. I tell you the one thing that you keep getting reminded of in London is that a place that seems the same isn't. It changes, and when it does, it's electric. And I think that the thing that I've loved about this project, the thing that I am incredibly grateful to you, David, to Brockton and Fora and JLL, is that when I left the BBC, it was this feeling that the world kept on moving at such a pace, you never got a chance to stop and think about things you really cared about. And I guess all of us in this room really care about London, and the chance to think about it and think about it together has been a great pleasure as well as a privilege. So for that, a big thank you, Enrico and Katrina, a big thank you, David, a big thank you to all of you for coming this evening. Stick around, do have a drink, chat, exchange good ideas, but for now, thank you very much.